Daniel Rowe had lived in the Redwood Haven community for almost 3 years without a single violation, warning, or even a passive-aggressive HOA note taped to his door. He kept his lawn trimmed, followed every architectural guideline, paid dues on time, and rarely interacted with anyone on the board except for brief hellos at the community mailbox station. But everything changed the day he welcomed his elderly parents, Thomas and Eliza Rowe, into his home for what he thought would be a peaceful 2-week stay. They were both in their 70s, his father recovering from a minor heart procedure, and his mother dealing with arthritis flare-ups that made living alone temporarily unsafe. Daniel didn't hesitate for a second. Family came first. What he didn't realize was that Redwood Haven's HOA president, Corinne Maddox, had recently become obsessed with maintaining resident purity, as she phrased it in her newsletters. In her mind, family members staying for more than 48 hours counted as unauthorized tenants, a ridiculous rule buried so far into the fine print that even lawyers debated whether it was enforceable. Daniel didn't know this rule existed, and legally it wasn't even valid. But Corinne thrived on intimidation more than legality. The trouble began the morning after his parents arrived, when he found a bright red envelope taped to his door labeled "Immediate Compliance Required." Inside was a notice accusing him of harboring long-term guests without HOA approval, threatening fines of $200 per day until the non-resident individuals vacate the property. Daniel froze, reading the letter twice, thinking he misunderstood. His parents? They were staying temporarily. They weren't renters, tenants, or subletters. They were just his parents. He laughed in disbelief, assuming it was a clerical mistake. But when he called the HOA office, Corinne answered with her usual icy composure and said something Daniel would never forget. "Rules are rules. Mr. Rowe, if your elderly parents cannot comply with community residency approval procedures, then they cannot remain on the premises." Daniel felt anger rise in his chest. His recovering father? His frail mother? He knew he wasn't going to let this stand. Not now. Not ever. Daniel tried his best to stay calm as he walked back inside, clutching the violation notice in his hand. His mother immediately noticed the tension in his face and asked gently, "Is everything all right, dear?" He forced a smile, not wanting to alarm them, but inside he was boiling. He knew he needed to address the issue before it escalated. He sat them down and explained the letter in simple terms, trying to soften the threat behind it. His father, still recovering and moving slowly, shook his head in disbelief. "We're family," he said, offended. "What sort of community treats parents like intruders?" But Daniel already had a sense of the answer. A community run by an HOA president who thought she was running a gated kingdom rather than a neighborhood. Later that afternoon, Daniel knocked on the HOA office door, an unnecessary formality, since Corinne always kept it closed, even during posted office hours. When she finally opened it, she greeted him with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. He held out the notice. "There has to be some mistake." Corinne crossed her arms and replied, "No mistake. Section 14B of the Redwood Haven Guidelines states that long-term guests must be approved by the board." He responded, "They're not long-term guests. They're staying for 2 weeks. And they're my parents." Corinne's smile disappeared. Unauthorized individuals staying more than 48 hours are considered residents under our regulations. If they want to stay, they must complete background checks, pay guest fees, and receive board approval. Daniel stared at her, stunned. Background checks? Fees? For his elderly parents? This rule isn't even legal, he argued. Corinne shrugged. "If you think it's not legal, feel free to challenge it. But until then, it stands." Her voice hardened. "And your parents must leave within 24 hours. Daniel opened his mouth to argue further, but she simply closed the door in his face. At that moment, Daniel knew he wasn't just fighting a rule. He was fighting a power-tripping board president who thrived on control. He walked home with one thought in his head: this is going to get ugly. But I'm not backing down. That night, Daniel sat by the kitchen table with his laptop open. The violation notice beside him, like an accusation, staring back. His parents had already gone to bed, unaware that the situation had escalated to something far uglier than a simple misunderstanding. Daniel began digging through the Redwood Haven covenants, conditions, and restrictions, an endless PDF filled with outdated language, contradictory rules, and sections so vague that even lawyers would groan. And then he found it. Section 14B, the rule Corrine had cited, did exist, but it had been added less than 5 months earlier without proper homeowner voting or approval. There were no signatures, no ballot records, nothing indicating it had been passed legally. It was a side rule, illegitimate, unenforceable, and clearly manufactured by the board. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he scrolled further, noticing a pattern. Multiple new amendments had been quietly inserted in recent months, all giving the board more authority while stripping homeowners of basic freedoms. No wonder so many residents complained about surprise violations. This wasn't regulation, it was manipulation. Fueled by frustration, Daniel drafted an email demanding documentation on the rules approval process and sent it to the entire board. Within minutes, he received a reply, not from the board, but from Corrine herself. Mr. Rowe, her email read, harassing the board with baseless accusations will only worsen your situation. Final warning. Your unauthorized guests must leave immediately. Daniel felt his jaw clench. Not only was the rule fake, but Corrine was doubling down, threatening him like he was some sort of criminal. He decided sleep wouldn't come until he had a plan. He knew he needed backup, legal, logistical, and emotional. He needed someone who understood HOA law better than Corrine did. And he knew just who to call in the morning. The next morning, Daniel made a call he rarely made unless things were serious. He dialed his older sister, Maya, a property attorney known in her firm for dismantling corrupt HOA boards like it was a hobby. When she picked up, groggy but alert, Daniel wasted no time explaining the situation. She listened quietly, and when he finished, she said, "Send me everything. Every document. Every email. Every rule they cited. This sounds illegal from every angle." By noon, Maya had reviewed the material and called him back, this time with fire in her voice. "Daniel, not only is the rule illegitimate, but the board can be held liable for violating several homeowner rights statutes. And threatening eviction of non-residents? Completely unlawful." She explained that HOA boards must legally submit rule changes for homeowner vote and maintain public records. Redwood Haven had done neither. She added, "Your HOA president is bluffing with a rule that doesn't even legally exist. And guess what? I'm coming over." When Maya arrived later that afternoon, Daniel felt a surge of relief. She wasn't just a lawyer, she was a powerhouse. They sat at the dining table reviewing printed copies of every questionable clause. His parents joined them, shocked at how deeply rooted the issue was. "We don't want to cause trouble," his mother said softly. Maya placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not causing trouble. They are. And we're going to shut it down." That evening, Daniel and Maya drafted a formal legal notice demanding immediate withdrawal of the violation, proof of legitimate rule adoption, and a cease and desist order for harassment. The letter was firm, professional, and devastatingly direct. Maya smiled as she signed it. This will rattle them. Daniel felt the weight in his chest begin to lift. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. Corrine had started a war, but now he had a legal weapon she wasn't expecting. The next morning, the HOA's intentions became crystal clear. I woke up to the sound of footsteps on my front porch, too heavy and too deliberate to be a passerby. When I opened the door, I found 2 board members standing there with clipboards, looking around as if inspecting a crime scene. They didn't even greet me. They just began taking photos and writing notes, whispering to each other, like they had already decided I was guilty of something. One of them finally turned toward me and delivered a rehearsed line. "We need to verify whether your current occupancy aligns with community standards." I knew exactly what they were trying to do. They wanted to catch my parents staying there so they could issue a violation before I could fight back. But my parents were already outside, taking a slow morning walk, enjoying the fresh air the doctor recommended for their heart and mobility issues. As soon as the board members spotted them, their eyes lit up with the kind of excitement you only see when someone thinks they've won. "There it is," one muttered. "Document it." My mother looked uncomfortable, clutching her shawl as they photographed her without permission, like she was some sort of problem. My father, confused, asked if they were from the census. I felt rage boiling inside me. I stood between my parents and the cameras, telling the board members to leave unless they had a court order. They smirked and said the HOA rules gave them authority to assess compliance. I reminded them that no rule supersedes basic human rights, privacy, or federal law regarding family accommodations. They clearly didn't care. They just wanted dominance. As they walked off, one of them said loudly, "We'll be filing the violation today." That was the moment I realized this wasn't just harassment. It was targeted, intentional, and possibly illegal. They didn't just dislike my parents staying over. They were actively trying to force them out. That's when the fear turned into determination. They picked a fight, and I was going to finish it legally, thoroughly, and permanently, by noon that same day. The violation notice arrived printed, sealed, and aggressively taped to my door like a scarlet letter. According to the HOA, my parents were unauthorized long-term occupants, and I was in breach of community residency restrictions. They demanded immediate removal of my parents within 7 days or face escalating fines, suspension of amenities, and even the possibility of a lien. My mother read the notice with trembling hands, convinced she had done something wrong. My father kept repeating, "We're only visiting. Why is this happening?" I reassured them again and again, but inside, I was boiling. The HOA wasn't enforcing rules, they were abusing them. I went through my HOA handbook page by page, highlighting every section about temporary guests, family accommodations, and emergency stays. Not a single line prohibited elderly parents from living with their children for medical reasons. In fact, state law and fair housing guidelines specifically protected families with elderly or disabled members. The board either didn't know the law or worse, they knew and didn't care. I compiled every piece of evidence, videos of the board photographing my parents, timestamps of their unannounced porch visit, the violation notice, and even copies of my parents' medical summaries that explained why staying with me was safer than living alone. I emailed the HOA president requesting an emergency meeting, citing multiple legal violations. He responded with a one-sentence message, "The board's decision stands." That was all I needed to forward the entire case to a housing rights attorney. When the attorney saw the notice, she immediately said, "This is a textbook case of familial discrimination. They don't stand a chance." We prepared a formal legal warning to send the HOA, one that cited every federal and state violation they had committed. My fear disappeared, replaced with a quiet confidence. They thought I would panic. They thought I would fold. They thought I didn't know my rights. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Asterisk, the attorney wasted no time. Within hours, she drafted a formal cease and desist letter addressed to the HOA board. outlining every legal violation they had committed. It wasn't just a warning, it was a fully documented case file. She cited the Fair Housing Act, discriminatory enforcement patterns, harassment, privacy invasion, and unlawful attempts to restrict family occupancy. She attached screenshots of the board members photographing my elderly parents without consent, timestamps of their early morning porch intrusion, and the violation notice that treated family like contraband. The letter demanded the immediate withdrawal of all violations, a formal apology, and a revision of their guest stay policy to comply with federal law. If they didn't respond within 72 hours, she would file a complaint with the state housing agency and pursue civil penalties. I delivered the letter personally to the HOA office. The moment I stepped inside, the room went silent. Board members avoided eye contact, pretending to be reviewing papers, but their stiff posture gave away their anxiety. The secretary reluctantly accepted the envelope, hands shaking slightly. On my way out, I heard one board member whisper, "This is going to blow up." For the first time since the ordeal started, I felt control shifting. My parents, who had been sitting quietly on the porch, looked relieved just seeing my confidence. Still, I didn't want them stressed, so I arranged a relaxing evening for them: tea, warm blankets, and their favorite old songs. But later that night, something unexpected happened. Around 11 p.m., my phone buzzed with a notification from my doorbell camera. Motion detected. When I checked the feed, my jaw clenched. It was the same board member who tried photographing my parents earlier. He stood at my door, flashlight in hand, peering through windows like he was hunting for evidence. Then he stepped back and took pictures of the driveway, the porch, even the living room lights. This wasn't rule enforcement anymore. It was stalking. It was obsession. And my cameras caught every second of it. I downloaded the footage immediately, labeled it, timestamped it, and sent it straight to my attorney. Whatever the HOA thought they were going to achieve, they just dug their own grave deeper. The next morning, the HOA board called an emergency compliance hearing. They claimed my presence was required. It was a pathetic attempt at intimidation. My attorney advised me not to attend without legal representation, and definitely not to let my parents go anywhere near the meeting. We sent a formal notice stating that due to ongoing harassment, all communication must now go through legal channels only. That apparently sent them into a frenzy. At 2 p.m., they held the meeting without me, but they didn't know I had access to the community livestream camera they forgot was public. From my living room, I watched them arguing among themselves, voices raised, papers slammed on the table. The HOA president looked furious, waving the legal letter in the air. One board member nervously pointed at the doorbell camera photos printed on the table. Yes, they had somehow obtained copies of their own misconduct. Another member complained that the situation had gotten out of control and that they should have left the elderly parents alone. The president snapped back, saying, "We can't back down now. We'll lose authority." That one sentence told the entire truth. This wasn't about rules. It wasn't about HOA regulations. It was about power-abusive, insecure, ego-driven power. They wanted control, and my refusal to bow had bruised their pride. As I continued watching, something unexpected happened. A newer board member, quiet, rarely involved, stood up and said, "I'm not going down for this. You all crossed the line. If she files a complaint, we're liable." He walked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The remaining members sat staring at each other, panic spreading across their faces. The president whispered something, but the mic caught it clearly. "Delete the footage. No one can see that." My attorney nearly laughed when I showed her the recording. The HOA wasn't just breaking rules. They were now attempting evidence destruction. That alone could cost them thousands in fines and possibly their board positions. The storm was finally turning in our favor, and they were scrambling like cornered rats. But they had no idea the real blow was still coming. The following day, the HOA silence was loud. No emails, no violation notices, no patrols circling my driveway like they had done for weeks. It felt like the calm before a collapse. Around noon, I received a message from my attorney. Check your community portal. Something changed. I logged in instantly, and there it was. The HOA had quietly updated the guest policy overnight. The new version stated, immediate family members, including elderly parents, may stay without restriction and are exempt from temporary occupancy approvals. It was exactly what we demanded. But the most interesting part wasn't the policy update, it was the digital timestamp. The change had been made at 3:27 a.m. They were panicking, terrified, trying to fix everything before consequences hit. But they still hadn't contacted us directly, which meant they hoped to fix the problem quietly and pretend nothing happened. Too bad for them, I wasn't finished. My attorney drafted a new letter stating that policy corrections alone would not resolve the case. The harassment, stalking, and discriminatory enforcement had caused emotional distress for both me and my elderly parents. Legal accountability was still on the table. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, something unexpected happened. There was a knock at my door, not aggressive, not arrogant, hesitant. When I opened it, 3 board members stood there, excluding the president. They looked embarrassed, almost guilty. One of them spoke softly. We want to apologize. Sincerely. Things went too far. Another added, we didn't know he was doing all that. They were referring to the late-night stalking, the photos, the intimidation. I didn't respond. I just let them talk, watching them squirm under the weight of their own actions. Finally, the oldest board member said, we're removing him as president at the next meeting. He acted alone in many decisions. That was a lie. I had proof they all played a part, but the desperation in their voices was real. My parents listened from inside the living room. My father whispered, Beta, let them go. They have families too. But I wasn't letting anyone off that easily, not after the way they treated my parents like criminals, not after the fear they caused. I told the board members plainly, your apology is noted, but this isn't over until my attorney says it's over. They nodded slowly, knowing there was nothing more they could do. They walked away defeated, their authority crumbling. And for the first time, I felt closure approaching. But the biggest shock was still waiting for all of us. 2 days later, the community experienced something it had never seen before. A full HOA membership meeting where almost every homeowner showed up. Word had spread about the stalking, the illegal rule enforcement, and the midnight policy changes. Neighbors who never cared about HOA politics were suddenly furious. We walked into the clubhouse to find board members sweating bullets. My attorney sat beside me, laptop open, evidence ready. The meeting began with forced smiles and fake professionalism, but the moment homeowners took the floor, the room erupted. One resident said, my parents visit every winter. Are you spying on them too? Another shouted, why are you changing rules at night? What are you hiding? Then someone played the recording I had shared privately with a few trusted neighbors, the one where the president said, delete the footage. No one can see that. Gasps filled the room. People turned on the board like a tidal wave. The president tried to fight back, stuttering, sweating, insisting the clip was taken out of context. But the damage was irreversible. A homeowner motioned for an emergency vote to remove the president. Hands shot up across the room. In less than 10 minutes, he was stripped of his position. Then came the next motion. Appoint a temporary committee to audit every decision made in the last 12 months. It passed unanimously. The board's power collapsed that night. After the meeting, people hugged my parents, apologizing for the way they'd been treated. My mother cried not from fear this time, but from relief. My father placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "You protected us." As we walked home, my attorney leaned in and whispered, "We can still pursue compensation if you want." I thought about it, the stress, the humiliation, the surveillance, the lies. But then I looked at my parents, smiling freely for the first time in weeks. "No," I said. "They lost everything that mattered to them. That's enough." The next morning, a notice appeared on the community bulletin. HOA leadership restructuring, effective immediately. A new board would be elected. Policies would be revised publicly. Transparency would be mandatory. The nightmare was over, and I made one promise to myself: never again would anyone, HOA or otherwise, try to intimidate my family. They tried to hurt us. Instead, they exposed themselves